Hi, this is Brian Choi with the Food Institute, and welcome to the Food Institute podcast. This week, we are speaking with Dr. James Richardson, founder of Premium Growth Solutions, a strategic planning consultancy for early stage CPG brands. He's also the author of Ramping Your Brand, a book focused on how to ride the CPG growth curve, which we'll be discussing today. But first, whether you are a first time or regular listener, we ask that you share this episode on your social media platforms. It helps us expand our reach, and we really appreciate it when you do so. So, with that said, I'll welcome James to the show. How are you today?
I am great, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to bring you on board. And, first want to say that I really enjoyed reading your book. And I think a lot of the content in the book is going to be extremely relevant. Not just, like an early stage CPG company, but I think there are also applications if you're a larger, food manufacturer as well. And so, we'll definitely talk about those concepts as we go through the podcast.
Great.
So James, you have a very interesting background, a very diverse background, and so please share with our audience your background, your current role, and the reason why you wrote this book.
Sure. So I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I'm an academic refugee, so to speak. Luckily, I sort of quit on my own before they quit on me, which is always the way you want to run your life. And I went into market research because that seemed like the best bridge for my brain at the time. This is about 2002, and joined a little boutique out in Seattle called the Hartman Group. And we were lucky enough to be sort of a startup-y kind of culture with an ADHD founder. So that allowed us to, I mean, that has a downside, but I think the upside is that we did a lot of experimental projects. And so we actually found a niche in growth strategy with specific companies like Kraft and Hershey's and a few others. So ConAgra Brands. So I specifically was able to take some of the behavioral theory that I was trained in, and a lot of that had to do with symbolic analysis, which is referred to in my book quite a lot. And we were able to help folks modernize their portfolios through various kinds of planning engagements. Sometimes that was brand specific, but a lot of it was actually at the corporate strategy level. So it was a lot of fun. We ended up doing some projects that actually impelled me to quit.
Oh, really? Okay.
In a positive way, which was we had some very big blue chip clients who wanted to really understand how to refine a playbook for the early stage brands that they were acquiring. Mm-hmm. And they were willing to spend the money to do the data science on that. And no one had really ever done it in the industry. And if Nielsen and IRI have done it, they certainly haven't published it. I don't think they have either. So anyways, we bought $150,000 worth of Nielsen data. And we did it for our clients. These are large randomized early stage sort of data sets. So we're talking, thousands of natural organic brands selling below $100 million. So this is that 10% of the money in the natural organic world. It's like 5% of the money out there, which is this mosh pit of early stage companies. And most of them are selling below $1 million. If you've ever looked at a Nielsen or IRI revenue ranked list, the long tail goes on like an Amazon catalog. It just never ends. Right. But none of the companies make any money. Right. So, this was the blue chip client in question was trying to understand, well, how do we pick better in our minority investments with these really tiny companies? Because it's like this chaotic soup and the metrics don't mean anything. Right. Like getting like velocity growth when you're a $500,000 trailing revenue company, that doesn't mean anything about your future. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's great for the present because you could hand that to the next retailer and sell yourself in. But long term, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
So they wanted to create a smarter set. They wanted to add a set of variables that weren't in Nielsen data. So we invented this metadata application process. And I think the Hartman Group still sells that service. It's fascinating, but I think what we learned some general principles about what grows, and they had to do with product design, which I know you wanted to talk about today. And so
Right.
some of the stuff that went into the book came out of that work, and it had to do with understanding the counterintuitive simplicity of product design that will command a premium price but grow really fast
Right.
without millions in dollars of advertising,
Right.
which is the only hope for today's entrepreneur, because who isn't just a rich guy, right? So I mean,
Right.
if you're Lance Collins, you just pump out serial winners because you have a network and a capital base that you can get anything to $50 million, right?
Right. Right.
That's not most people. So, and honestly, it's not most brands that investors are going to find, right? Because they're only going to write certain kinds of checks.
Right.
I have yet to see a venture capital firm, and we won't see one that's going to write a $30 million capital check to a $500,000 trailing revenue company because they
Right.
just love the product so much.
Right.
So it's, you laugh, Brian, but our listeners at Big Co, what do? They spend $1.5 million on pre-launch work,
Right.
2 million sometimes on product development fees, market research, crossing T's, dotting I's, sending PowerPoints up the chain, Nielsen bases forecasting, and when all the stars align, what do? They assign $30 million.
Right.
So
Right.
it's not like there aren't companies that will assign a big check with no market feedback about the
Right.
product. And this is
Right.
the thing, when I left, when I stopped working for big co-innovation teams, specifically earlier in my career, it really started to dawn on me how crazy the whole model was.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the biggest form of like Vegas gambling I've ever seen. But it's like not only did you have card counters, but you had like a rack of other specialists who would be studying, everything else they could about the casino to game it.
Right. Right.
Because the theory was to go spend crap loads of money right off the bat before you had any data from a real human being about whether or not your thing is remotely interesting.
Right. And
Um,
that's why we've seen a lot of these acquisitions and these checks, when the
yeah.
checks get sent out, a couple of years later, a lot of these big CPG firms end up divesting them at a loss, right? Because they haven't spent the time understanding the consumer, right? And so there's a lot of wasted money
Well, you'd
out
be.
there, and that's what.
I think you're right, Brian, and I think that it's so funny because I've worked, as you can imagine, I worked post acquisition
Mhm.
at big firms, studying some of these acquired businesses for them and trying to help them um, optimize the acquisition. And it was amazing the the um, the lack of consumer behavioral intelligence that these companies had, and yet Piper Jaffray would be out there selling, hawking it all over the investment world, right? So
Right,
now
right,
maybe and so you've got this betting going on, which is based on fairly high level data, Nielsen data, velocity stuff, and some other financial valuation alchemy. And that's the basis of most of these transactions, Brian.
hmm
It's not a deep understanding of this is a skinny pop and here's why. So, anyways,
hmm
the book was inspired in part because I kept meeting I kept meeting founders with like 8-figure businesses who knew nothing about why they were growing. They had
hmm
no answer to why. But
Got it.
and then they were going to go spend money on, $500,000 on marketing or raise a whole bunch of money. And, it realized, I'm like, why is everyone guessing in the early stage? There's no need for this.
Right, right. I
Right. So,
100% agree. Yeah.
but we have to have something better than, what I would call that $2 million pre-revenue overthink,
Right,
which I honestly used to. I mean, that my paycheck came out of that overthink. So
right,
it paid
right.
the overthink paid my mortgage for years. So I think but I realized it was overthink, because until you have your product out there, even a line extension, you're kind of kidding yourself to think that you know what you even have.
Right.
I mean,
Uh,
there's no survey of people that can predict what it's going to taste like if they've never tasted
Right,
it.
right. So this book is really, as you said, geared towards early stage CPG founders and entrepreneurs, right? So is it fair to say, we're talking about a million? Well, there's different stages of growth that you mentioned in the book, but
Correct.
but the majority of the focus is kind of like 5 million less, with an emphasis on, especially on the really early stage, as founders are thinking about their growth strategy and launching. Is that fair to say, James?
I would say I wrote it for that group,
Okay.
but I wrote it knowing that there'd be other folks who would sort of be leaning over their shoulder reading it with them, so to speak. Um,
Got
and
it.
and what's been interesting is that, as you might suspect, I get calls from people who want to, they're at 8 million or 10 million and they want to get smarter about some of these things, especially why their business is performing the way it is. And I think most of the principles of the book will help anybody at any stage on the way to scale up. Um, quite frankly, so it was written for that larger group, just because if you can learn some things about your business that are non-traditional as an entrepreneur, and a lot of this has to do with your fan behavior, um, then some of it has to do with your planning and how you
Hmm.
approach strategy. The data would suggest strongly, although I can't prove it scientifically, uh, that you're going to grow faster and longer and with a better chance of scaling. In other words, it's ironic because the people who tend to invest money in like optimizing and correcting the early stage business have hit a problem generally between like 20 and 40 million.
Hmm.
So they're hardly
Right.
startups, right?
Right.
And that is not the optimal time to come in and like do cardiac bypass surgery.
Right.
The time to do it is in the early years. But what I found, is that you can't. Um, I get people calling me, Brian, who want to, they're pre-revenue, a little more on the risk-averse side. Probably some of them are refugees from big co, so they got brainwashed by risk aversion.
Right.
So they can't fully extricate from that mentality, and they want to work with me. And I'm like, it generally doesn't. It's not productive,
Hmm.
because we need to have your thing out there. We need to have real data, and it's easier to collect that than ever before. That's what blows my mind. Um,
Hmm.
it's not like 1995 where I don't know what you would have done.
Right.
I mean, you would have had to do field marketing. That would have been the only way to issue a questionnaire
Right.
or any kind of feedback. But it's actually so easy. And you don't need rocket science data.
Right.
But I think getting people to realize that you got to get closer to consumer early on if you want to optimize these businesses and up your chance of surviving and scaling. Um,
Right.
that's my mission. It's not always successful,
No,
but
but
it's my
it's
mission.
and it's important. This is, I think the principles that you lay out in the book, not only every entrepreneur, but like, they need to know this stuff, right? Because it'll save a lot of headache, right? And years of time in ramping up their businesses. And one of the things I liked about in the early part of the book, you talk about these various growth trajectories of companies slash product sales, right? And you talk about the big co CPG growth model, the skate ramp, the unicorn path, the wheelchair
Mhm.
path. Um, you know, can you describe for our audience like what these various growth models are and what you see as the quote ideal and most common growth trajectory for a successful startup CPG company?
Sure, yeah. So you know, I think the public firm audience on the podcast will recognize the Big Co growth model because it's the one they live and
Right.
breathe, and that is the line extension of the known legacy trademark with high awareness and high household penetration. So it's relatively um, safe bet to extend off those brands, and that is about firing stuff out to pretty basically maximum ACV in the first year, turning on advertising or trade marketing or both, and then crossing your fingers. Uh, and now, if you really want to get cynical, and I think not to cause people to leave the industry because that's not my intent, but there is, when you get up into the finance world of these companies, and the people in the marketing team don't always interact with these folks, but I can tell you there's a finance model at CPG companies. They know how to monetize a failed line extension. I know that sounds crazy, but they monetize failed business launches all the time. And I say failed because they're never there after 3 years, right? You go back,
Right.
you go back to the store and like, where did that go?
Right.
It was delisted, my friends. But they still made money off it.
Right.
And that's why, so people use, I, I answered this question. I used to annoy my clients with all sorts of extraneous off scope questions to learn. That's what I used to do. And this is where I learned this stuff. It's like, well, if the failure rate's 80% plus for line extensions, why do people keep using the exact same process? And it's like, well, it's a failure because it doesn't stick around, but we make money off it.
Right.
So yes, it's a failure, but not really. Because if we just have a pipe, if we have a pipe full,
Right.
then we can make money. So that's that launch. Instant distribution, pretty robust marketing budget on day one. And you actually aren't, it's not a model about long-term survivability, really. I mean,
Right.
sometimes it is when you have a big new brand bet. Like when Activia launched in 2006, you can be damn sure that the people in France were intended that to survive, right? And to be honest, they supported it, and they didn't just, and they launched that in a very different way. But that's the primary path in big companies, because there's a way to monetize that. But that's not growth, Brian.
Right.
That's I like to call it monetizing product fads, because that's basically what it is.
Right. And it seems like it's a lower risk, like compared to if you're
Oh yeah.
early,
Oh
right? So
yeah.
it's a lower risk model that doesn't guarantee earnings, but it's a high probability that, given that you've already had successful
Hmm.
product in the past, you're just kind of adding an additional product
It's
there that,
financially efficient
yes, that's a
product
great term.
innovation
Right.
because
Right.
it's coming out of the same plant. The plant paid off 30 years ago. I
Right.
mean, not to sound like a car owner, but I mean that's basically the model, right? So it costs you nothing, almost nothing to devote some runtime to this line extension. Your sales guys can sell it in their sleep. It's just
Right.
so easy, Brian.
Right.
What's terrifying is, and I still don't. I once wrote a white paper, and I just drove my team nuts because I'm like, no, we need to look harder. There can't be just two. We found two. This was in 2013. We found two case studies of new brands that were launched internally at a public firm and food companies that grew to scale, grew to at least 9 figures, and kept growing.
Hmm.
And were still growing at the time we wrote the white paper. Right.
Hmm.
In other words, they were the skinny pops of their time. Right.
Right.
One was Journo in
Hmm.
1995, was one of the most successful packaged food brand launches in the history of American food industry,
Hmm.
because it wasn't based on the early phase of the American food industry. It was actually a bunch of entrepreneurs who then sold. I mean, we
Hmm.
forget all this, but that's what
Hmm.
this Mr.
Right.
Lay, Mr. Lay, yeah,
Right.
dude was an entrepreneur.
Right.
So he wasn't some big corporate dude. He
Right.
was an entrepreneur making potato chips in Texas.
Hmm.
So we forgot about that wave because it turned into a bunch of holding companies. But
Hmm.
very very few of these companies are able to do what DiGiorno did, what Activia did in '06. And those are probably the most successful examples that we found. I mean, DiGiorno clearly.
Right. Right.
And I don't, although I focus on natural organic because that's where that's where the unmet demand is in terms of the population right now, in terms of people willing to pay a premium price
Hmm.
for food or beverage or beauty or whatever it is. These things have happened at big companies before. It's just they haven't. And I never got the answer. I mean, I know the Activia story was be a European company and come to the United States. That's the
Hmm.
answer. Because European multinationals think differently than multinationals in New Jersey. It's just end of story. And part of that is the stock market in Europe.
Right.
Right? It's not quarterly,
Right.
so that's a huge help. But I think that the terror that I would see in the eyes of people who wanted to try to do something with a new brand. I mean, it literally became this game. As a consultant, it became a game of sort of whack-a-mole the objections,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Or, it just never ends because basically no one wants to do it. So they just that's when you have an organization that's allergic to change, is when they
Right.
just throw up objections.
Right.
With that, I mean, they're almost unconscious objections.
Right.
And most of them are totally irrational. I think the industry moved towards acquiring these innovative brands, but I think what I try to get at in the book is there's no reason you can't do this internally from a creative perspective.
Right.
From an intellectual perspective, absolutely. The question is, politically, at a big company, can you get an entity to take the risk to build these things? And I think the answer is basically no in most of these companies. So we're left with acquisition, but how do you acquire more intelligently? Well, your acquisition strategy should be no different than your design strategy.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to look for the same things. And they're sometimes correlated to POS or scanner data performance.
Mm-hmm.
But man, I can't tell you the number of brands I've seen that were smoking hot, Brian, up through 20, 30 million, and boom, suddenly they stop growing.
Mm.
Right.
Right.
And now founders will often complain, well, I didn't get my capital raise, but I've networked with a lot of these people. And, in many cases, especially I'd say before 5 years ago, many of those stagnating brands, they actually have a symbolism problem. They have a product portfolio problem.
Mm-hmm.
They captured a niche, but the niche did not extend to other larger addressable markets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, which I didn't put in the book, but it's not coming to me. I mean, I think there are, and I can't divulge my client work, which is a pain, but there are ways you can take something that's stagnant, say at 20 million,
Mm-hmm.
tweak the symbolism, tweak a bit of the formulation, and turn it into something that's going to grow really fast with the right application of resources. I know that sounds crazy, but it's almost like if you think about going to a prom or something, the symbolism, your costume, right? And it seems superficial.
Mm-hmm.
How important could the front panel symbolism be?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, actually, quite important. If for some reason you build a $20 million business targeting, what I like to make fun of in the book is sort of this neurotic, paranoid wellness consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And I've met
Mm-hmm.
these folks. I've interviewed many hundreds of them, and
Right.
they don't provide good word of mouth
Right.
because everyone thinks they're nuts. I mean, I hate to be rude, but they
Right.
do. So it's like vegans used to be this crowd until they developed this urban hip version of themselves. I call them
Mm-hmm.
power vegans.
Right.
who work at ad agencies to make $750,000 a year. But anyways, so before, when the old vegans, the first gen vegans, were a classic group that they couldn't market ice to the Inuit,
Right.
right? because they were so hardcore, so extreme, basically offensive, right? Like any other extreme or militant group, and so they don't end up. And so if you dress your otherwise tasty thing in that kind of veneer,
Mm-hmm.
you can actually get to 10, 20 million pretty easily today, but then you'll hit a wall
Right.
every single time. And it doesn't matter what kind of check you write.
Mm. Right.
And I'm not even sure it matters if you get like a Shawn Mendes to endorse you,
Mm-hmm.
if it's dressed in that weirdness.
Right.
So I talk about weird in the book because there's a lot of stuff that scales today to 8 figures that's still got all this weird symbolism, weird flavors even.
Right.
And you can still manipulate that stuff and tweak it and get the thing ready to go. I mean, if you look at like the history of the products that showed up at Expo West, and you'll still see this, virtually in their virtual shows too, I'm sure, you still have people who will be attracted to the extreme weird of the wellness world.
Right.
And they will be and these people are so passionate,
Right.
and they
I've
will get
met them.
so
Yep.
excited, and
Hmm.
they're so passionate, so excited, but they haven't got the basics of how you design something that's scalable, right? And so
Hmm.
I think I wrote the book in part to help those people correct a few things early on when it's easier. Um,
James, you wanted to touch. I wanted to touch a little bit. Going back to these growth
yeah,
curves,
I'm
right?
sorry, I
No, no,
drifted a
it's
little.
completely fine. And so you described the big co, which is an immediate growth in revenue, and it kind of like tapers off, and then and there's really not much growth after that. And then the skate ramp, which it's an exponential growth, right? And so you don't really get the initial huge boost as you might with the CPG growth model. It's a slower ramp, but then over time it just grows exponentially. The unicorn path is just huge growth upfront, right? And I think you bring up the example um, of boom chicka pop, right? As an example of that type of growth. So how many of the companies that you advise or you observe kind of are able to represent that skate ramp versus a unicorn path, and even the wheelchair, the slower growth steady wheelchair path? Like, if you can kind of give us a little bit of a description of that.
Yeah, so in the early stage, you basically have, like you said, you have those three paths, and the ones that scale generally 99% of them in my old research followed one of those three. But what we found, interestingly enough, up through 2017 at least, was that 75%, at least of the sample that we looked at, that made it to nine figures and stayed there and didn't collapse,
Hmm.
um, rode this skate ramp of exponential growth. And so then we were compelled, and about 25% crawled up the
Okay.
wheelchair path. They just slowly went. And it's really the difference between linear and nonlinear growth, Brian. That's what the book is exploring. And um, how do you create that differential which will cause exponential growth to happen? And when we looked at the brands and how they went to market, the book's not based on founder interviews. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah, no, I did notice that.
There's not a single founder interviewed in my book. And I'm sure there's some who are castigating me right now for that. But the reality is that I'm a social scientist, so I possess a primal arrogance. I'm just going to say it. A primal arrogance, not associated with my personality, it was associated with my training. And that is, individuals can't explain their own behavior because I spent 9 years in a field where that's the basic assumption.
Right.
Um, and I believe it even more now, having gotten that training than before. So I don't believe there's any founder. Dan Lubetzky can't explain to us why a Kind Bar succeeded. It's his baby,
Right.
right? He's too close to it.
Right.
But the main reason is not even that. It's that founders don't spend their time doing the pattern analysis that would allow you to figure anything out, because that's what academics do.
Right.
Or consultants, right? And that's who I am. So I, the difference between the skate ramp is not, it was a more complex puzzle when we got into it. And it was very clear to me that several practitioners of the skate ramp had no idea what they were doing at the time.
Hmm.
Like, no clue. I mean, it literally happened. It happened despite them.
Right.
Or like in the case of Kind Bar, I think it really was it was a classic example of having the correct intent
Hmm.
vis-a-vis the marketplace that caused the organization to make the right investments in an undercapitalized brand
Hmm.
that would then get the enthusiasm, get the consumer to work for the brand and
Hmm.
build the thing. And those were sampling and field marketing, right?
Hmm.
And we saw that pattern everywhere amongst these skate ramp brands that would grow exponentially. In other words, when we tied it back to the math, we're like, what are these guys doing across all these businesses, generally speaking? At least three-quarters of them, that was our standard. What are they doing that's causing the velocity to continue to grow
Hmm.
for years? right? I mean, like forever,
Right.
right? So, because, if you look at a Lay's potato chip, with all those facings built over and all that presence built over decades, right? They're able to sell on a store basis, hundreds of freaking bags a week
Right.
through their
Right.
now that didn't happen overnight.
Mm-hmm.
That built over decades, and it's probably still building, right?
Right.
It's at least building with population growth.
Right.
So
Right.
for every
Right.
baby born, Lay's gets its share. So
Right.
it's
You're right.
eventually.
It's true. It's true. The numbers don't lie, right?
So, but the question is, with the early stage brand, how do you get that velocity to grow? Because if you look at the data, this is what we found. When you look at the data, the average early stage brands, it grows distribution velocity tags, grows
Mm-hmm.
distribution velocity tags, grows distribution velocity tags. And at some
Mm-hmm.
point, the velocity basically hits a wall.
Right.
And so for every store that they add, they just get the same units per store per week. And it becomes this weird, the brand starts getting driven by salespeople
Right.
because it appears that that's the only thing that's working.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, the brands that ran the skate ramp, what they're doing is that they invested in out of store activities. They had better product innovation, better product symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that is by accident.
Mm-hmm. Right.
um, and they're generating word of mouth in ways that I would call it boring specialty food Z is not doing
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, right? So by looking at the contextual factors in a patterned way, we're able to deduce some best practices, a very short list, and most of it's in the book. Um,
Right.
the rest of the magic comes down to understanding your offering in the context that it is, and how can you create a playbook that will grow velocities.
Right.
And so that's basically my professional occupation right now, is sort of that art form. And I think it's an experimental thing. That's what I tell people.
Right.
Because
Right.
I think you write a book on something, and I think because so many people write business books that are just sales sheets.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
literally, I read one this summer that was literally like every page was like, and my trademark said, I was like, oh, come on, man.
And that's what I like about the
So,
book, and because it's refreshing because it's not written by one of these founders that have a very skewed view on their own baby, right?
well,
And
I guess we can say this on the Food Institute, but I'll run with you, Brian, because this is probably the only podcast I can say this on. I just, I tire of founder interviews, Brian.
yeah,
That's the politest way I can say it. What I say to my wife is not polite, but the point, it's false data.
right.
I mean, the way I look at it is this is how I should probably use this as a client interview question. If you want to learn about a famous person, do you want to read their autobiography, or do you want to read the biography? I want to work with people, obviously, who want to read the biography.
Right.
If you just want to hear someone talk about their life, that's great. I mean, it's very entertaining, I'm sure. But the idea that you're learning about how they tick makes no sense to me.
Right.
So that's just
Um,
propaganda, right? So I think so I think the growth paths that people have are limited if you want to get to scale. And we found that the skate ramp path was the most effective bet. The problem, Brian, is you have to wait for scale. And
right.
this is what the math's very simple. It's actually not new, I don't think, but the patience is lacking.
Hmm.
And it's lacking at big companies. But the weird thing is, once I got out of the big consulting world, it's lacking in the entrepreneurial world in a way that I just makes my head scratch. I just don't
Hmm.
understand. It's like you have all this freedom as an entrepreneur, and one of those freedoms is to take your time.
Right. I think
I
part of
just,
it is just the greed, right? Because
I
they
guess.
probably like left the big they left the cushy job, and now they're earning no money, and they want to scale as quickly as possible, so they end up making decisions that forego the long term growth that
I
you talked
I
about.
I think there's been more of that. Um, and it's ironic because we have a couple things going on in the early stage universe. One is the rise of what I call the professional entrepreneur, but that's a person who's scaled at least two businesses,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, or at least one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they go do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And that person, I can tell you, is very attractive to private equity. Like
Right.
VMG and Kavud, they all know those guys. They have their, I mean, they have a Rolodex of everybody who's won, and because they
Right.
want to work with them, they want to invest in their next thing, right?
Right.
But that's one crowd, very interesting group of founders, super tiny, by the way.
Right.
I actually, on my own, I actually went, when I was writing the book, I looked for a list, tried to create my own list of what I believe are true serial entrepreneur geniuses.
Mm-hmm.
And I have my list, and it's 6 people.
That's a very small list.
And yes, one of them is Lance Collins, who I made fun of earlier.
Yeah.
The guy, and he had a huge failure in the '90s before Fuse. I mean, he had at least one business just totally blow up in his face.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I love about the guy, is because he kept going,
Right.
and then he won. And for whatever reason, he's figured out a thing. I think he just happens to be very intuitively smart about innovation. That's my
Right.
personal. I mean, that's his actual genius more than anything else. And I think there's very few people who are like that. The founders of the Snack Factory, they're another
Mm-hmm.
one. I apologize for not remembering their names because they don't do PR. They're not
Mm-hmm.
They're not egomaniacs. No, seriously, they're entrepreneurs and they're very
Right.
good. But there's
Right.
very few people who do it again and again and again and again and again.
Right.
You were referring to this influx of people who I think who have left big companies and want to go try this on their own. But you're right; some of them have not really gone through that whole psychological, like, what are you really signing up for?
Right. It's a very
uh,
different world, right? And
yeah, but I also meet impatience from people who don't come from big companies. I've been shocked,
mm-hmm.
and I think I try not to blame it on greed so much as just our culture. It's a cultural problem, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think it's ironic. I don't think it's an accident that Dan Lubetsky, an
Mm-hmm.
Israeli American, was patient enough to grow kind. That to me is explainable.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had a huge dose of non-American cultural influence.
Right.
Same thing with Hamdi.
Mm-hmm.
He's an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Different makeup, different view of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Not the typical American-born entrepreneur.
Right.
And I think Silicon Valley is really the worst model.
Right.
That is that because they get a lot of the media time.
Right.
So even I constantly meet people who actually are using Silicon Valley tech startup jargon as they're
Right.
planning their food startup. And I
Right.
and I know they're not getting it from business school. They're getting it from the media.
Right. Siggy's is another one.
Oh
Siggy,
yeah, well,
which is
the Icelandic man. So
right.
it's
Right.
like we
Yeah.
see a pattern here.
Right.
I hate to be pro-European, but it's not a total accident.
Yeah. That's a very perceptive comment because I don't think there's enough research out there about the cultural influence of some of the most successful companies, right? And but I want to kind of focus a little bit more on these kind of the formula, and you talk about this book there. There are 5 different things that you mentioned in the book, but um, as you look at the kinds of the world, the Siggies, those who follow that unit, the boom chicka pop, what are the key elements that were so critical to their success? And if you can kind of share some of those elements with our audience, I think that would be great.
I will. But I can't resist correcting you because you just gave ConAgra. They're collapsing right now because you swapped out Boom Chicka Pop for Skinny Pop.
Oh, well,
But but Boom Chicka Pop did ride the skate ramp. It's
mm-hmm.
really interesting in its own
Okay.
way. I talk about some laws because I don't know. It just seemed like the right way to describe what I've seen in large data sets that I've reverse engineered. So I think the most important one right now in early stage CPG is that you can't just launch like a a clean label product,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that the natural version of this, the organic version of that, right? It's all been done, and it was all done 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. I mean,
Right.
I think I know about a handful of categories where it hasn't been done, where there might be some promise. So
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking, you have to do something more innovative than that, but it's a bigger issue than that, Brian. It's that if you're launching something on the basis of it being more pure than, I don't know, Doritos, you are talking to a not very important group.
Right.
And I'm just going to say that.
Right.
And yes, they run one of the largest trade shows. So, or did, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever's going on. So,
Right.
and I think that's been it's not, my clients get it. I think most people get it. But I think that some people who come to the entrepreneurial world through that natural products funnel do not get it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I still see too much Me Too innovation out there, um, based on that misunderstanding. So you've got to do something with your formulation,
Mm-hmm.
or your formulation, or your format,
Mm-hmm.
or your formulation and your format and your packaging design
Right. Right.
to create something innovative symbolically in the category that's going to command a premium price and has to be about more than purity. It's got to be something else.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, this was the specialty food industry, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of that stuff is actually pretty processed, Brian, if you flip the labels over.
Right.
It's kind of interesting.
Right.
Not
It's
so much
true.
anymore. Not so
Right.
much anymore. But on the, like, if you go to the stuff like, my favorite used to be Patak's Indian sauce, massive brand in the UK. It would process to the nines, because it was a mass. I mean, it was a mass market consumable in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So it just, yeah, they wanted to make money. So um, I think you've got to have something that is going to shake up that category. And that is really the art of product design. Now, what that is, and this is the thing, what that is originally when you launch, that's a guess, but we don't know that that's actually the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of people who launch thinking that their edge is X, like, I don't know, sustainability or how they source their ingredients. And in reality, the consumer, the fan, is telling them quietly something else.
Right.
But if you're not listening or interacting with your consumer, then you can develop, and I've seen it, entire marketing strategies that are based on the founder's understanding of their thing, not why people keep buying it.
Right.
So
And you
that,
talk about this in part two of the book, right? Where
yeah,
you describe these product launches as, quote, experiments where you're creating, testing and iterating. And I think that that's a huge part, that's a huge part of understanding kind of what's going to ultimately work, because you're right. If you're a founder and you have a certain idea of what the product should be, how it's going to scale, and you're not really listening, that this part is so key, like listening to your customers, talking to them, getting multiple data points, and you might end up with a formula that's different from what you
yes.
originally thought. And so I think
I
that's
think
a
the
critical point.
problem is that the problem I had writing the book, and I'm very self conscious of it, is that most of the case studies I talk about did not necessarily involve that process amongst the founders.
Mm-hmm.
So some could point to that as a weakness, which is like, well, um, look, these guys did it and they didn't do any of that. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's why so few people scale.
Right.
Is my point. So that's my retort is, well, that's why it's rare
Right.
when you don't deliberately do it.
So
But I would argue that someone like Siggy was actually very experimental the way they managed
yeah,
that business. They were
yeah.
very, very careful.
I remember meeting
So
the founder a couple of years back, and he was just describing, how he's just started making yogurt in his kitchen, right? And and it took a while for people to um, uh, not only test it but also like the flavor, because the flavor profile is very different
oh yeah.
from a Yoplait, right? It's very different, and you got to get used to the flavor profile. But over time, people you start liking it, right? Because it's less sugar, because
Yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit more thick than the convention. I'll call it the conventional brand.
Yeah, I mean, I think Siggy's. I love that brand for so many reasons, which is why, because there was patience,
Right.
because there was there was the right kind of weirdness, not the wrong kind. The weirdness was it was sour,
Right.
but it was like, but the consumer was well, the beauty of it was the consumer was embarrassed that they didn't like it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like I should be more okay with this, but I'm not. Why is that? Right.
Right.
And so they almost sort of talk themselves into getting used to it, at least the early adopters. Because the low sugar was kind of, I mean, was mainstream in beverages when it launched, but not in food. And so
Right.
getting people to get their tongue and their nose used to less sweet foods has been this journey in every
Right.
category.
Right.
And he started early in yogurt, which was a massively over sugared. I mean, Yoplait has cut their sugar a ton since then, by the way.
Yeah, but it
Most people
still
have.
tastes very sweet to me.
Yeah,
Maybe,
well,
and
that's
maybe
the
my
whole
my
point.
taste pattern has changed over time, but it's still it's still very sweet to me. But
It is, yeah, and I think what Siggy's also did well, which is another one of the laws I talk about, is they, and this was more of an accident, right? Because it was just his passion for the family yogurt, right?
right.
Uh, was that they had formulation anchoring, which is what I
Hmm.
call it. In other words, they had their low sugar slash weight management signal, their attribute outcome signal that was really powerful, was embedded in the formula,
Hmm.
right? Because if you don't make the skier like skier, you don't get that.
Hmm.
And it created something no one in their right mind would have chased. So he had no competition,
Right.
without, and big companies were aware that he existed,
Right.
right? And they just ignored it because the gross margin on skier sucketh.
Right.
Because it takes 4 gallons of milk for every gallon you get.
Right.
And that's not how you make money in refrigerated yogurt. So, no, I'm serious. So, I mean, it's one reason why he ended up selling to Lactalis, because that's a multinational dairy conglomerate built on global low margin.
Hmm.
Like they get it. They know how to do that. Danone is not interested in that. so, but but think about that insulation.
Right.
And so, that's a little extreme because I certainly don't advertise that people go for crazy low margins
Right.
when they're broke and have no money. But there's something about anchoring your formula, however it is, in a way, and margin isn't the best defense mechanism,
Hmm.
but it's one.
Hmm.
If you're in a category where everybody, all the incumbents, they wake up in the morning and they're like 60% gross margin, and you're launching something innovative at 35, they're not going to chase you.
Hmm.
They're not even going to chase you with a line extension.
Hmm.
So that in business strategy, these are important moats sometimes, and you got to making sure that your symbolism is embedded in proprietary, co-man controlled R&D that no one else has and is unlikely to reproduce is totally underinvested in.
Hmm.
And I don't understand why.
Hmm.
I just don't understand why, because in the world of early stage, people just don't. It's very hard to get a co-man to do a proprietary formula.
Hmm.
So if you can get that going, it's going to be very hard to copy it. That's what. Whereas if you go like Ryan into the world of like extruded snacks right now, where like
Hmm.
everybody and their cousin has like a lentil puff, that's an example of not anchoring in a formula,
Hmm.
because anybody with an extrusion pellet gun can do that,
Yeah. James, I
right?
wanted I wanted to bring up an example, that you bring up in the book, and it's a company called Power, right?
Yes,
Um, can you? So you
they
mentioned the
still
five.
they still like me apparently after.
So so can you walk us through these five elements, but using that example,
Ooh, the
and
laws.
what
Yes.
and going through the laws, what yeah, if you can just define those laws in the context of cauliflower, I think that would be very helpful for our.
So cauliflower, to be fair, is what I call the unicorn.
Hmm.
And the one thing I noticed with early stage unicorns is they observe a couple of these laws, Brian,
Hmm.
which partially explains, well, if not entirely explains, why they grow so crazy out of the gate. Aside from good management, 'cause I will say that launching a unicorn is an exhausting sales challenge. I mean, to
Hmm.
open up stores that fast. But anyways, definitely the law of N+1. Sure, cauliflower is a natural product with clean label, but that wasn't the point. The point was a low carb plant based crust that wasn't, this diabetes inducing refined flour crust, right? That's the whole point.
Hmm.
So check.
Okay.
High stakes consumer outcome, weight management, check. Right now, this was one of those brands where I didn't get the founder was never talking about that. Gail was never talking about that. 'Cause I don't think that was her interest. Her interest was in better nutrition.
Hmm.
Right? It was like a classic New York dietitian nutrition kind of thing.
Right.
um, but great example of where I think the founder's motivation may not have been the most important thing,
Hmm.
right? But what consumers are saying is we already know symbolically that anything that had net carbs that low in a high carb category would catch people's attention,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because you're inverting the expectation with the
Hmm.
package symbolism, and people are going, "Whoa, you kidding me?" Now the second thing is the pizza tastes really good. I remember being at Expo East when that launched, and I'm sitting there going, "Oh God, here we go." You don't want to follow me around at a show, Brian. I'm such a curmudgeon. But I was, I have very low expectations, and I was
Right.
blown away.
Hmm.
And so I knew that, oh wow, this will get good repeat
Hmm.
because it potentially is weird, right? Like, why are they talking about cauliflower in my pizza? That's not a There's no cauliflower in the Domino's menu. People don't put cauliflower on their pizza. So this is really strange.
Hmm.
Oh, it's cauliflower crust. Okay. So, it has a potential to backfire,
Hmm.
but they did well on the sensory. So that attribute outcome symbolism happened to be timed, I think, pretty well in the marketplace because, um, as I showed my book, in the internet chatter around cauliflower low carb dieting was already steadily growing in the 5 preceding years. So they hit this timing, um, and that was beautiful.
Hmm.
And obviously, they anchored the symbolism in the formula.
Right.
Now this is not a defensible innovation. That's the problem.
Hmm.
So, um, in a way, they probably were smart to hit the gas like 6 months in, which normally you would never do.
Right.
But they had explosive. I mean explosive velocities. And when you're getting explosive velocities in the first 6 months, and I mean velocities on par with the market leaders in pizza, like maybe
Right.
one or two rungs below DiGiorno.
Right.
I'm sorry. When you're getting velocities like that
Right.
in the first 6 months, or like, and Skinny Pop was the same way, then you have a big choice, and it's a lucky choice. You can hit the gas with capital, a little capital, and then just ride that unicorn. Or you can do the skate ramp path if you'd like. The problem is, I think they were smart in a way, which is they realized there was no defensibility.
Right.
So I probably would have done the same thing.
Hmm.
And it's not what I recommend to the average founder, but it had to do with their innovation. Although it hit a bunch of these laws, it was also very focused. They didn't, in the first 2-3 years, they didn't like fire out 12 categories of cauliflower product. um, they're branching out now, but I think not in originally. So it's a very focused pizza brand. And honestly, that's the only way you can be a unicorn, because your sales team, I think, would probably lose its mind.
Right. Right.
Not to mention your operations people trying to like keep track of when things are growing that fast. I mean, we're talking just below the level of a line extension in terms of distribution ramp.
Wow.
it,
Amazing.
I mean, it's not going to 90% ACV, but these things are going to 50, 60% in a year and a half, 2 years. I mean, that's crazy for an independent company.
Right.
That's insane.
That is insane.
And so they only chased it because the numbers were just. I have another client I can't talk about who's in the same situation in other categories. So it does happen, but it's less than 1%.
Right.
so when I talk to people about these laws, yes, cauliflower hits most of them. but you're probably not going to have that kind of market timing. You're going to be more like Siggy's, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
had this amazing thing, but probably 10 years ahead
Right.
of the average college educated person's true level of interest in desugaring their food.
Mm-hmm.
He was way ahead.
Right.
Why? Because the dude's from Iceland and he was eating like an Iceland dude. So to him, this was normal. He obviously wasn't running to 7-Eleven doing big gulp every morning
Right.
after his yogurt. So it was
Right.
just it was not his thing. So
Yes.
being the cultural alien gave him all this crazy advantage, right? Because he's almost like the anthropologist, going, God,
Right.
these Americans, look at them stuff the sugar in their mouth. These Americans. So
Yeah.
it's just to
No,
him, it was obvious.
it's interesting. I think the now in the market, so there's two things going on, right? One is the pace of change, right? Especially
Yeah.
with Gen Z and millennials, like the rate of these consumers wanting something new and different. It's very would you say that it's very different than 10, 15 years ago? Like
Oh yeah,
I find
yeah.
myself wanting to try new products much more now than even just 5 years ago, right? So
Well,
this adventurism sort of mentality, that's that's one aspect. And the second aspect is you have a much more diverse population now, right? And so
yes.
when consumers have when founders are trying to formulate this product, it's not as easy as it was 5, 10 years ago, right? And so the flavor profiles, the different formulations, it has to be different. It has to be something unique. It has to stand out, right? And you do mention that in your book.
And
Uh,
flavor is one of those interesting ones too, I
yeah.
think, because, and I'm with you, Brian. I think what we're seeing, not to go jump back to my old field is that we are going through a demographic shift due largely to two forms of immigration.
Right.
One is for lack of a better word, exploited underclass
Hmm.
of Latino immigration. And then you have this global UN sort of college grad tier
Hmm.
of people coming in with good income, good education, and for various reasons. And many of whom do become American citizens on fairly short order. And that has exploded in the last 20 years. And we also have the birth rate differentially high in non Caucasian groups in the United States. So what's happening is the assumptions of big co about what is a normal flavor have shifted.
Hmm.
Uh, now I think the big companies have been tracking this. I know Frito-Lay has always been on the forefront of that. They're not flat-footed around those things, but flavor is still a bizarre thing because I find in a lot of categories, despite these trends, like in yogurt, and no one's been able to sell weird flavors in yogurt, despite
Hmm.
all of this. And I think it has to do with the cultural dynamics of that category. So I do think that um, while the cultural diversity is definitely ratcheted up,
Hmm.
and it will continue to be more diverse, there are what it means, I think, is that there'll be more fragmented consumer demand than ever in food, and
Right.
that scares the bejesus out of the primary listeners
Right.
of this podcast, right? Because they work for big companies that want massive scale efficiencies. They want to be off plants that produce 1 to 2 million units a day.
Hmm.
They, this is
Right.
that's their world. Like
Right.
they don't want to hear that taste preferences are fragmenting
Right.
because it becomes less efficient to service that.
Right.
And I don't know where it leads in terms of the industry, but it could lead to a new generation of holding companies that simply are willing to deal with those audiences.
Right.
You know,
Fascinating. Yeah. No,
I mean,
this is fascinating, and yeah, I wish we had more time, James. We're coming up to the hour, but perhaps we can follow up with another podcast and talk about parts 3 and 4, of the book. And
great.
but so this wraps it up for the Food Institute podcast. James, where can our listeners go to learn more about you and Premium Growth Solutions, and how can they purchase your book?
Well, they can definitely go to Amazon.com right now and type in "ramping your brand." Be honored if you purchased a copy. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can go to premiumgrowthsolutions.com. And if there are any founders listening, then I encourage them to go to the founder resources page on my website and take my quiz, lovely, in which I will brutally judge them. No, I will help them understand whether they're ready for exponential growth, because you have to get ready for it. That's what I've learned.
Right. I definitely recommend the book. It's I found it very resourceful, very, to the point, and no BS, which is the way I like it. Right. And so it's very clear that you know what you're talking about. You come at it from a scientific angle, which I really appreciate. And so we'll definitely share the relevant links in the description of this episode. So once again, I'd like to thank James for his time today. Remember, if you're new to the Food Institute podcast, please follow, like, and share. If you'd like to learn more about the Food Institute, please take a look at the links in our description to learn more about us and what membership could do for you and your company. Until next time, this is Brian Choi signing off.